Well, everybody, it is time to gather. This side is kind of empty over here if we've got some folk. This is the sheep side. This is the goat side. So if you want to come this way and fill up a little bit, that would help. We're so glad that all of you are here today. My name is Molly Marshall, and I am in my 4th year as president here, which doesn't seem possible, and it's with great gratitude to serve in this time. Let me identify some of the folks who are in the room. We've got trustees here. If you are a trustee or a former trustee, Jeff, would you all wave? Thank you all for being here. We have a former dean in the room, Dr. Steckel, yes, always. And a former president in the room, Dr. Yates. So good that you are here. One of the nicest things about serving here is that Wilson and I get to do presidenting things on occasion together. I'm grateful, very grateful for that. How about alums? Anybody an alum from the 60s? I don't think you're telling the truth, Mallory, when you stuck your hand up. Yes, Chuck, you are. Very good. Were you at Mission House? Is that correct? Yes, sir.
Class of 1960.
All right. Very, very fine. Do we have anybody from the 70s here? Yes. Yes, Sue, Karen, yes. Eric, yes, good. Wonderful. How about the 80s? All right, very good. And the 90s? Very good. And then the 2000s. Yay, good. And the 2010s and forward. All right, very, very good. Pardon? Any potential students here? All right, oh yes, yes, all right. Good. Well, we're glad that you have gathered today. How about faculty? Will you all wave this direction? Thank you all for being here. And since we had commencement just about a week and a half ago, Dr. Hillary Vomstad has become Dr. Hillary Vomstad. Would you stand? Yes. She did her oral defense the day after commencement. She will never have to go to purgatory. I mean, she has done her time. I mean, a pretty amazing feat, Hillary, and we're really, really proud of you. Let me call on Dr. Justin Sabiatanis, who will introduce our lecturer, and again, welcome to all of you.
Thank you and good morning. So an alum of United, Priscilla Braun, from the 1980s, established the Susan Draper White Lectures in memory of her grandmother. And this endowed event allows us to offer regular lectures that explore and celebrate women in religion, theology, and ministry. And we are so pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Joy Ladin as this year's Susan Draper White Lecturer. Now, there are many, many laudable aspects and accomplishments that I could share with you today to introduce Dr. Ladin. She has published numerous volumes of poetry and other writings, including making both early and continuing meaningful contributions to the study of transgender theology and biblical interpretation. She has degrees from Sarah Lawrence College, an MFA in creative writing from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a PhD in American literature from Princeton. She's a well-known and respected speaker and teacher. But let me tell you, though, 2 things that I particularly admire about our speaker. First, She writes about God in ways that I absolutely love in her books and in her stories. God has a personality. God can be pesky, or absent, or present, and meaningful or challenging. She and God banter and wrestle. They are companions. She charts in her writings her continually emerging knowledge of who God is and who we are in relation to the divine. And this inspires my own ongoing exploration of the holy when I read her. Second, Joy embodies both gentleness and strength. I heard her speak last year at another seminary. And in the Q&A portion, she was asked how she handled being with those who oppose transgender rights and how we could avoid being hurt in those interactions. And she answered, I'm sure I'm not quoting her completely correctly, but she answered something like, her desire for our community was that we would be strong enough within ourselves that we could engage those opponents and remain steadfast in our knowledge of who we are. That she longed for us to be strong in those ways. And this is what our sacred texts teach me when they talk to us about how we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so that strength and that gentleness, that willingness to encounter difference is something I deeply admire about her. So I hope that you will join me and that you will be blessed as we welcome Dr. Joy Ladin.
Thank you so much, Justin. It's an honor and really a thrill to get to be here with you and talk about things that I love and love talking about and don't have a lot of folks who are willing to sit there and talk with me about them. So thank you all for doing that. Before I go further, I want to make sure, am I audible? I'm not hearing any protests otherwise, so I'm going to assume that I am. All right. Tradition teaches us to hear the God who speaks in the Hebrew Bible as he. He socializes with patriarchs and matriarchs, soliloquizes in visions, thunders from mountaintops, whispers in a still small voice, commands and comforts, blesses and brags, rages and forgives, and, in the opening of Genesis, talks light into emerging from watery darkness. But neither tradition nor the Bible tell us how it sounds to hear divinity as she. Rabbinic Judaism took a step in this direction by imagining a female-identified immanent aspect of divinity, the Shekhinah, to complement the male-identified transcendent God who dominates tradition. Unlike the thundering, commanding, transcendent he, the rabbis imagine the Shekhinah as dwelling with rather than beyond us, sharing our joys and struggles. But they don't describe how the Shekhinah speaks, or how conceiving of divinity as female might challenge patriarchal traditions. For most of my life, I didn't wonder about those things either, because despite all the capitalized he's in biblical texts and Jewish prayers, I never thought of God as male. Even though I grew up in a non-religious family, as long as I can remember, I felt God's presence and a sense of kinship with God as someone who, like me, didn't make sense in terms of binary gender. I didn't make sense because though I was born and raised male, I always identified as female, while God, bodiless and faceless, everywhere and nowhere, made no sense in human terms at all. Though I was a chronically suicidal child whose life depended on hiding who I was, and God was the creator of heaven and earth, to me it seemed we shared a similar social predicament. Our inability to fit the terms human beings use to identify one another made us both invisible and incomprehensible to those we loved, shipwrecked in sight of a human world to which we could never truly belong. I never thought of God as transcendent any more than I thought of God as male. To me, God was just there. And because I grew up in a non-religious family, no one taught me to think of God in any other way. The closest I came to theological instruction was reading Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim, a collection of stories about 18th and 19th century wonder-working rabbis who pioneered a mystical, experiential form of Judaism called Hasidism. Those stories were set in a world I'd never known, among Jews whose lives and practices were foreign to me, but I kept rereading them because in their world, unlike mine, God mattered. One story that stayed with me describes a pious man who gradually becomes consumed by the fear that, as he put it, there is no judgment and no judge, by which he means no God to witness or give meaning to his life. He withdraws from his religious community and family and flees to a distant city, where he locks himself into a tiny rented room and stares into the existential abyss his doubts have opened. Suddenly, he hears a knock at the door. When he opens it, he sees his rabbi, who smiles at the agonized man and says, "I know, my child, and if I know, how could God not know?" To me, the story was as puzzling as it was moving. My peculiar feeling of intimacy with God made it hard to understand the man's crisis of faith, or the idea of God as a distant judge, encountered only when life was over, that precipitated it. I couldn't imagine how he could need another human being to know that God knew and cared about him. I lacked the empathy and theological sophistication required to see that thinking of God as judge had enabled the man to feel that his life mattered to God, and to recognize God's presence in a world where good people often suffer and evil is rewarded. It took me decades to realize that my own relationship with God also depended on thinking of God in a particular way, and that my conception of God, like his, had theological costs as well as benefits. Thinking of God in terms of God's inability to fit human categories made me feel close to God, but it also made it hard to understand others' spiritual lives, particularly the struggles of those who thought of God in male-identified terms like God, judge, or king, that make God seem distant. The fictional man's conception of divinity as transcendent judge gave him a sense that God cared about his life, but it also made God seem impersonal. Judges, after all, aren't supposed to have relationships with those they judge. And in a world where good people often suffer and evil is rewarded, hard to recognize at all. It wasn't until I started talking publicly about my lifelong struggle with gender identity that I thought about the relationship with God that had enabled me to survive it. Was my sense of God's presence idiosyncratic, an outgrowth of my particular circumstances? Or was it something which, as I had long assumed, anyone could experience if they paid attention? Over the years, those reflections grew into a book of trans theology, The Soul of the Stranger, reading God and Torah from a transgender perspective, that offers my relationship with God as an example of how our awareness that we don't completely fit gender or other categories that others use to identify us can help us think about and relate to God. This theology suggests a way out of the kind of problem that bedevils the man in Buber's story. Instead of thinking of God as a transcendent figure who has nothing in common with humanity, we can empathize with God as someone who, like us, can never fully fit human categories, and so, like us, can never be fully understood by those we dwell among and love. From this perspective, what makes us feel different and distant from human beings can help us feel close to God, who knows such feelings well. The book uses this way of thinking about God to make sense of the Bible's portrayals of how hard it is for God and human beings to understand and relate to one another, and to suggest how the experiences of trans and non-binary people can help illuminate religious texts and traditions. I also hoped thinking of God as a stranger in the human world would help others feel connected with God by turning the sense of difference that makes it hard to relate to God into something God and we have in common. But in retrospect, I doubt that this conception of divinity would have helped most readers or the man in the story. Locating our relationships with God outside human categories cuts us off from the many ways that, as tradition shows, human roles like judge or father can help us relate to God. And though it's theologically important to remember that we can't understand God in human terms, if all we focus on is God's incomprehensibility, it can be hard to relate to God at all. I didn't recognize this problem when I finished the book. but I did notice what for me was a new sense of spiritual loneliness. I still felt God's presence, but focusing on my inability to understand that presence made it hard to feel close to or cared about by God. Even though God was still there, God felt like a stranger to me, and I felt like a stranger to God. This was my first taste of the kind of crisis the man in the story experiences. The first time my conception of divinity had made it harder to feel connected to God. Though I had no words for it at the time, I was longing for another way to think of and relate to God, a way that linked God's transcendence of human categories like gender with divine presence and love. Despite the biblical Israelites' difficulties in relating to God, they have no trouble simultaneously experiencing God as a transcendent, utterly incomprehensible being, and is intimately involved in their lives. In fact, I think they experience that as a sort of curse at certain times. The God who demonstrates transcendence of nature and human history by scourging the Egyptians with plagues and transforming enslaved Hebrews into a free people is the God who speaks to every Israelite directly at Sinai and delivers 10 commandments meant to shape their daily lives. The God who thunders those commandments from above is the God who feeds the Israelites manna every morning, a God so close that God's feelings are hurt when they complain about having to eat the same thing for decades. All the Israelites had to do to experience God as simultaneously transcendent and immanent, both incomprehensibly beyond and intimately involved with their lives, was to look toward the Mishkan, the tabernacle they constructed according to God's detailed instructions, and see the divine cloud that rested on it by day and the fire that rested on it by night. Visible signs of God's presence they followed through the wilderness to the promised land. After the 5 books of Moses, though, this fusion of transcendence and immanence weakens, with more emphasis on God's transcendent judgment and control of human history, and fewer divine manifestations that portray God as directly involved in human lives. Even when God appears at the climax of the book of Job, rather than answering Job's anguished questions about the meaning of his sufferings, God silences him with a torrent of rhetorical questions, highlighting God's incomprehensible power. I'm not a scholar of Judaic thought or culture. I'm what my wife calls an amateur theologian, although a passionate one. But it's clear that in post-biblical times, the trend toward thinking of God as transcendent continued and became linked with thinking of God as male. This linkage fits the masculine pronouns and case endings the Hebrew Bible usually uses in connection with God, and the male associated terms, such as Lord, warrior, father, judge, and so on, that are often used for divinity. But the Bible also occasionally uses female verb forms for God, and it includes many non-masculine forms of divinity, from ungendered and inhuman metaphors like rock to explicitly female images, such as Isaiah's description of God crying out like a woman in childbirth. Most importantly, other than angelic appearances, none of God's manifestations to human beings, from Sinai's thunder to Elijah's still small voice, are gendered at all. When Moses at the burning bush asks God for a name he can use when the Hebrew slaves ask who sent Moses to deliver them, God doesn't identify as male and brushes aside the idea of gender or other human-style identity by saying that God's name should be Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which can mean either I am what I am or I will be what I will be. Now that I think of it, that would be a great name for many of our politicians. In the rabbinic tradition that blossomed after the Roman destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, we also find a variety of terms and images for divinity, but the ones that came to dominate religious tradition and popular imagination identify God as both male and transcendent. The male-identified conception of God as transcending and ruling over human history was no doubt comforting to Jewish communities wondering where God was amid centuries of Roman domination. But as Luke Devine and David Ariel and other scholars suggest, This emphasis on God's transcendence opened what Ariel calls an abyss between the transcendent God and Jews traumatized by the struggles of exile, the destruction of their nature, and the loss of the temple. The rabbis bridged this abyss by complementing the male-associated idea of a God who controls and judges humanity from afar with a new, immanent, female-identified conception of divinity, the Shekhinah. The idea of the Shekhinah grew out of rabbinic reflections on the part of the Hebrew Bible that describe God dwelling in the midst of the Jewish people, particularly those where the verb for dwell, from the Hebrew word shechan, is conjugated with a feminine case ending. And I can't tell you how utterly characteristic it is of rabbinic tradition that an entire theology would grow out of a single verb in the Hebrew Bible. That's really the way the rabbis roll. Unlike the male-identified, transcendent aspect of God, the rabbis imagined the Shekhinah as immersed in daily experience, so close to human feelings and experiences that she weeps at our funerals and dances at our weddings. As befits a female-identified outgrowth of patriarchal religion, the Shekhinah is imagined as not only complementing, but as subordinate to the male-identified, transcendent aspect of divinity, suffering and enduring the existence he controls, remaining silent as he commands and instructs, exiles, and redeems. When I was growing up in the 1960s, the Shekhinah was little more than a footnote to mainstream Jewish thought and practice. She was mentioned in a few prayers and some oft-cited rabbinic sources, but was mostly referred to in connection with Kabbalistic mysticism. In the Kabbalist's widely known tree of life diagram, the Shekhinah is treated not as an aspect of divinity who shares human lives, but as the final step in a 10-stage process by which the incomprehensible oneness of God is differentiated into the world we experience. In other words, the Shekhinah is portrayed as an ontological umbilical cord through which divine energy enters and sustains the material universe. The Shekhinah received little attention from mainstream American Judaism until Jewish feminists began resurrecting her in the 1970s and 80s as part of their efforts to reimagine patriarchal Jewish tradition and practice. Jewish feminism had an enormous impact on non-Orthodox forms of Judaism, leading to the ordaining of women as clergy, the election of women to leadership positions, and an overhauling of Jewish education, liturgy, and institutional policies. Feminist efforts also led to the Shekhinah being highlighted in a few more prayers and liturgical notes, though these changes had little effect on how most American Jews and Jewish theologians thought and talked about God. Though I'd experienced the institutional effects of Jewish feminism my whole adult life, I didn't become aware of Jewish feminist theology until the late 2010s, when, in the course of working on The Soul of the Stranger, I belatedly encountered a famous exchange between two leading Jewish feminists, Cynthia Ozick and Judith Plaskow, in the early 1980s. Ozick, an Orthodox Jew and acclaimed writer, had published an essay called Notes Toward Finding the Right Question, in which she explains what she considers the proper focus of Jewish feminism, challenging the treatment of women as lesser and other in traditional patriarchal Judaism. Ozick rejects the idea that Jewish feminism should also engage in theology, particularly objecting to their calls to include female conceptions of God in liturgy by, for example, referring to God as queen rather than the traditional king of the universe. Such efforts, Ozick sneers, stun with their crudeness. Millennia after the cleansing purity of Abraham's vision of the one creator are returned as sex goddesses, fertility goddesses, mother goddesses. This is the new vision to restore dignity to Jewish women, a resurrection of every ancient idolatry the Jewish idea came into the world to drive out. So she's not a fan. Ozick is less contemptuous, but just as dismissive of feminist efforts to resurrect Jewish tradition's native female conception of God, the bodiless, imageless Shekhinah, who was rabbinically designed to fit Judaism's monotheistic principles. While Ozick agrees with feminists that it is as foolish to refer to God, the creator of the universe, as he, to her, it's equally foolish to refer to the creator of the universe as she. On those grounds, she not only rejects efforts to highlight the Shekhinah and other images of God grounded in women's lives, roles, and prayers, and experiences in prayers and Jewish teachings, she rejects the very idea of Jewish feminist theology. Not surprising, Glasgow, a groundbreaking feminist theologian, disagrees in a rebuttal called "The Right Question is Theological," and both of these are wonderful essays, and I can't recommend them highly enough. Glasgow sees Ozick as representing a mainstream Jewish feminism that Glasgow characterizes as a civil rights movement rather than a movement for women's liberation. Glasgow shares Ozick's civil rights concerns about the image and status of Jewish women in religious and communal life. But for Glasgow, women's liberation also requires the theological overhaul of patriarchal traditions that reflect and reinforce male supremacy with masculine language for and images of God. Citing Clifford Geertz's argument that religious symbols are simultaneously models of a community's sense of ultimate reality and models for human behavior and social order, Glasgow argues that male God language also functions as model of and model for, both telling us about God's nature and justifying a human community that reserves power and authority to men. From Glasgow's perspective, every capitalized he and reference to God as Father, King, and so on reinforces the marginalization of women that Ozick decries, and implies that women's lives are irrelevant to understanding or relating to God. But for Glasgow, women's liberation requires more than the equal gender representation in liturgical language. It requires a theological revolution of the very sort that, for Ozick, betrays the monotheistic nature of Judaism. The goddess, Glasgow insists, must be acknowledged as part of God, for the God who does not include her is an idol made in man's image, a God over and against a female other, rather than the creator of both maleness and femaleness. For Glasgow, embracing the goddess as part of God, conceiving of divinity as she as well as he, isn't betraying monotheism. It's saving monotheism from the idolatry built into patriarchal traditions, insistence on representing God as male. By the time I read this interchange, the argument seemed largely settled. Mainstream non-Orthodox forms of Judaism more or less reflected Ozick's civil rights approach to feminism, though more radical feminists such as Rabbi Jill Hammer continued to develop and encourage Judaism to include the sort of female-centered theology, liturgy, and ritual Glasgow calls for. I saw no need to take sides in my trans-theological work. Ozick's argument clarified the resonance I saw between trans and non-binary experiences of not fitting gender categories and God's inability to fit any human categories. Glasgow's argument explains the theological value of expanding our conception of God by including the experiences of trans and non-binary people who, like women, have traditionally been treated as other when they've been noticed at all. But in reading Ozick and Glasgow in relation to trans theology, I left behind what they were actually arguing about, what it means to reimagine religious tradition in ways that put women's lives at the center, where men's lives have long been. Sorry. I didn't take that question personally until the spiritual loneliness inspired by my version of trans theology and a chance invitation to read poetry at a Shekhinah conference kindled my longing to hear the Shekhinah speak. At first, I responded to the invitation the way I respond to most poetry gigs, by rummaging through old poems to see what might be relevant. I'd written a few poems focused on the Shekhinah or Shekhinah-like presences in my 20s, but as I knew at the time, they weren't really about the Shekhinah. They used the Shekhinah as a veiled metaphor for the female gender identification I didn't dare directly express in poetry or life, for the sense of being female which, like the traditional conception of the Shekhinah, was always there, but invisible, silent, sharing but powerless to transform my miserable male existence. Since life as a man was long behind me when I got that invitation, those poems didn't interest me. What sparked my imagination was the idea of writing about the Shekhinah not as a metaphor, but as a living, speaking divine presence. I didn't think of this as a theological effort. I just wanted to see what would happen if I tried to do what millennia of Jewish tradition hadn't. Imagine the Shekhinah speaking. I'd always wanted to play God. Yes, guilty confession. And really, I thought I was well qualified after I got the PhD. Um, the words of my fictional Shekhinah poured out of me into poems that, as far as I could tell, pleased the conference audience almost as much as they pleased me. But when I returned to these poems after completing The Soul of the Stranger, I realized, to my horror, that they constituted the poetic equivalent of idolatry, reducing divinity to a self-serving reflection of my own ideas and desires. I decided to abandon the project, but when I tried, I felt bereft, not of those poems, but of the presence they pretended to give voice to. Suddenly, my spiritual loneliness crystallized into longing to hear the actual Shekhinah speak, not as a poetic persona, but as divinity living in and through every human being. I didn't have a spiritual gift or practice that could enable me to tune into the Shekhinah's voice. So I decided to follow the example of the biblical prophets, probably always a good idea, and try to write poetry through which the Shekhinah, rather than I, would speak. But the prophets were channeling a divine voice that came to them involuntarily. Unlike me, they didn't have to wonder how that voice should sound or what it would say. I decided that instead of trying to imagine what the Shekhinah would say, as I had when writing the poems for the conference, I tried to discover her voice by rearranging language that wasn't mine, the way moving magnetized words around on refrigerators can lead us to sentences we'd never come up with on our own. To increase the odds that this method would lead me to the Shekhinah, I mixed words from Isaiah's divine monologues with words from articles in Cosmopolitan, the women's magazine, hoping that by arranging and rearranging biblically certified God language and editorially certified women's language, the Shekhinah's voice would eventually emerge. Since tradition offered no examples of what that voice should sound like, I kept moving words around until sentences formed that seemed to be speaking directly to me in a voice that made me feel naked, exposed by a love I couldn't evade, a love that made me afraid. Here's an example of that voice, which emerged as I mixed language from Isaiah 47, where God says, "You say to yourself, I am, and there is no one besides me," and a Cosmo article called, "The Scary, Scary Way Your Friends Are Losing Weight." Exactly. Melting away. I sit in the stubble of your heart, listening to you say, I am. I am, you say, and there is no one besides me, by which you mean no one to remember, no one to love, your wise and childish, tender, obsessive, intermittent selves, melting together, melting away. I am, I say, but you don't hear me. On good days, you wish I was there. On better days, you crave me. On the best days, you feel me, sitting amidst the brokenness of your body, your strange, shiny pleasures and cardiac butterflies, lifting the veil of your darkness, setting your dust on fire. I am, I say, and there is no one besides me. And for a moment, you know it's you I'm calling, that I'm the love into which you're falling, evaporating, one I am at a time, a part of you, the only part that isn't melting away. This is the voice I hear as the Shekhinah's, a voice that speaks from a perspective far beyond and deep within us, from which she observes every psychic twitch and tremor of the human you she addresses, the you she means to signify each of us, including each of you and me. That's what scares me about her voice, and what makes it feel like hers rather than mine. Unbound by time, space, or mortality, the Shekhinah somehow comprehends the fragmented, narcissistic whirl of existential terror, loneliness, and fleeting realization I try to conceal from everyone, including myself. This is an extreme form of what theologians call immanence. Immanence isn't a static quality, as we see in the Hebrew Bible, which portrays God in many kinds of proximity to humanity, filling the woven walls of the newly finished tabernacle, arguing with Moses, responding to the elderly Sarah's silent laughter at the idea that she and Abraham are going to have a child. But in melting away, the Shekhinah comes so close that the categorical difference between divinity and humanity blurs and sometimes melts away. The Shekhinah identifies herself by identifying us, describing our feelings from a perspective that enables her to simultaneously experience, transcend, and reflect back to us the conditions, mortality, fragmentation, isolation, the strobe-like flickering of self-awareness that define our existence. That's how the Shekhinah proves she's there. The Shekhinah comprehends us so completely that it's hard to tell where we end and she begins, an extreme form of immanence that transfigures binary distinctions such as self and other, and human and divine, the way a half twist turns a loop of paper with an inside and outside into a Mobius strip in which each side somehow brings us to the other. This drove me crazy for years when I was a child. We see this at the end of Melting Away, where the Shekhinah's description of our human I am leads seamlessly to the divine I am that surrounds and suffuses it, as her witnessing of our dissolution reveals her as part of us, the only part that isn't melting away. Jewish tradition imagines the Shekhinah's immanence as a female complement to male-associated transcendence. But there's nothing gendered about this category transcending proximity to humanity. In fact, in Melting Away, and in many of these poems, there's nothing to identify the Shekhinah as female at all. This, I suspect, would disappoint Judith Plaskow, but come as a relief to Cynthia Ozick, as well as to Jewish feminists who, like Marcia Falk, sought to reimagine Judaism's patriarchal theology, were skeptical of championing the Shekhinah as an equal opportunity aspect of divinity, because, as Falk writes, in Jewish tradition, the Shekhinah has never been on equal footing with the male-identified God, of which she was only a manifestation. And while I like the name itself, Shekhinah, from the Hebrew root meaning I dwell, I would like to see indwelling, or immanence, portrayed in ways that are not secondary to transcendence. So too, I would like to see autonomous female images, not ones that imply the essential otherness of women. To Falk, no feminist repurposing can change the fact that the Shekhinah is an outgrowth of a patriarchal tradition that defines her as a subordinate complement to male divinity, and thus as an expression of male supremacy. This leads Falk to call for something we can't find in Jewish tradition: autonomous ideas of both femaleness and immanence that are not defined in relation to maleness or male-associated transcendence. Though Falk didn't convince me to abandon my efforts to hear Shekhinah speak, she helped me recognize that the poems didn't have to portray her as talking in ways we think of as female, or avoid ways we think of as male. As an autonomous female, the Shekhinah could use gendered language, but would never be be limited to or defined by it, because, as God says at the burning bush, she is whatever she is and will be whatever she will be. The same, I realize, must be true of the Shekhinah's immanence. As in the portrayals of God we see in the 5 books of Moses, the Shekhinah's autonomous immanence not only coexists with, but is inseparable from her transcendence, enabling her to share our experiences, lives, and psyches without being limited by the terms of human existence. Rather than presenting a Shekhinah defined in opposition to patriarchal divinity, melting away gives voice to a Shekhinah who's independent of the way patriarchal tradition defines femaleness and eminence, a voice that transfigures, dissolves, or shrugs aside the binaries that traditionally shape our ideas of God and divine human relationships. But even when they don't include the kind of female God language Glasgow calls for, women's lives are woven into all the poems in Shekhinah Speaks through the Cosmo articles from which so much of their language is drawn. Articles whose titles, included as epigraphs, highlight feminist issues such as how medical care fails women, why American women are dying in childbirth, anti-abortion attitudes, I had an abortion in Alabama and my neighbors shamed me, women's sexuality, the G-spot doesn't exist, that came as a shocker to me, and media portrayals of women, 7 empowering life lessons from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's a really good read. And though she doesn't do so for explicitly feminist purposes, in a number of poems, such as the one I'm about to read, the Shekhinah does use female God language, speaking of herself and her relation to the human you in ways that reflect women's lives and treat them as sources of revelation. Singing. Before you were a fetus, before you were an egg, you were a song I was already singing, a promise I'd already kept. I stretch out your curtains, strengthen your pegs, make room inside you for the world I created you to share. You are my embryo, and I am your womb. You're my labor pains, and I'm the mother pushing you to cry, to talk, to stand for something, to stop being scared of the joy rising like waters in the days of Noah, flooding your foundations, crowning your head, answering every question I created you to ask. Why you feel incomplete, like a tiara without a pageant. Why you mistake affliction for love, and love, my love, for affliction. Why you just start crying when for a moment you hear me singing the secret you forget you're keeping. You are the child of a queen. Why it always feels like the first time to you, the first shaking of your mountains, the first bursting into flame, the very first season of your first reality show, on which a queen with a whirlwind where a uterus should be, whose presence fills you with fear, keeps waiting for you to say I do, to the love, my love, that never stops singing and follows you everywhere. The female God language here, fetus, egg, embryo, womb, uterus, labor pains, queen, mother, tiara, prompts us to understand the Shekhinah's relationship with us in terms of female bodies, roles, and lives. The patriarchal religion tends to portray as irrelevant to, unfit for, or threatening divine human relationships. This offers a glimpse of what Glasgow means when she argues that gendered God language elevates certain kinds of lives by presenting them as models of and models for. Just as male God language encourages us to see men's lives as models for understanding and relating to God, the female God language in singing encourages us to see women's lives as models for understanding and relating to the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah uses terms from women's lives autonomously, without regard to ideas of femininity or masculinity, applying them to humans of every gender. Like the God we hear in late Isaiah, the Shekhinah diffuses the idolatrous danger of imagining God in human terms by shifting too rapidly from one to another to suggest a single, coherent idea of her identity or her gender. Thinking of the Shekhinah as a womb and ourselves as embryos is very different than thinking of her as a woman in labor and ourselves as her labor pains, or of her as a guest on a reality show and ourselves as a contestant she's just proposed to. Such female God language comes and goes too fast for us to reduce the Shekhinah to any human idea of she. But the Shekhinah doesn't use female God language to tell us who or what she is. She uses it to help us understand her binary melting proximity to our lives, not just as a unilateral expression of divine immanence, but as an invitation to share the consensual, reciprocal, mutually vulnerable relationship humans call intimacy. Though the Shekhinah is always there, she wants us to know that just as when we get advice from a mother or receive a marriage proposal, it's up to us whether or not to pay attention to her or what she's saying, whether we're going to ignore, reject, or return her love. So I want to end by reading the final poem in the book, composed of words from Isaiah 47 and a Cosmo article called 12 Achingly Beautiful Bridal Trends You'll Want to Steal for Your Wedding, in which, yeah, I wouldn't wear any of them, um, but the Shekhinah uses words from that and from Isaiah to invite us to respond to her presence by saying, as the title says, I do. Unhappy, storm-tossed, uncomforted one, you ache for me even though I'm here, stitching kindness and desolation, flowering and fear into walls and gates and battlements from which you can always see you don't have to ache for me. I'm everywhere. It's your attention that comes and goes, half inside, half outside, whirling, trailing, twisted and tied. Sometimes I'm an idea you get, sometimes a terror that comes upon you. Sometimes I make you sick, and sometimes I'm just there, a color that goes with everything you wear, an invisible crown winging closer, settling in your hair, a strand of song floating like a veil, calling you to realize, to remember that wherever you are, I am, wrapping you in righteousness, jeweling you with fire, wedding your affliction to my compassion, your once to my forever. It's true. I'm yours. I've always been. The moment you say, I do. Thank you.
And I think we have time for a few questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, Stella has a microphone there that we can pass around. And folks online, you could put something in the chat and let us know you have a question.
Am I directing the question? Oh, okay, now that our speaker is back on. I wasn't sure who I was directing the question to. I thought, Dr. Ladin, this was really quite creative, especially given you have a creative writing degree. I looked at your LinkedIn account, of course, too. But I was struck by, I think you used the word voiceless, but I was struck by where are the voices of the biblically dispossessed, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan? So I was just wondering, how do you interpret that with the Shekhinah, since she really wasn't, I mean, at least by the rabbis, the historical rabbis, given a voice either?
Well, that's a great question. But actually, I just want to say, I think that the biblical passages that command us to, and say that God cares a lot about whether we pay attention to the voices of the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the dispossessed in one way or another, that those passages mean it's always a question that we should be asking ourselves and our institutional structures and our power structures and our religious traditions, right? By definition, those voices are voices that are hard to hear and voices that are often excluded and overlooked. And I think that it's striking that in those biblical commandments, we don't hear the voices of those people. Occasionally we hear them in biblical text, but it's pretty occasional. The rabbis are extremely concerned with those aspects of Jewish tradition, because for them, a lot of God's holiness, or a lot of human beings' ability to participate in God's holiness, reflect God's holiness, fulfill the purposes of being human, consists in our relationships with other human beings, both individually, like we're not supposed to treat one another badly, love your fellow as yourself, as in the Torah portion that we read this week, but also the communal relationships that those biblical verses are pointing out. They're pointing to what we would now call institutionalized marginalization, discrimination, and oppression. So they do talk about that. And as I said, not a scholar, but there are a lot of stories and anecdotes in the whole of rabbinic tradition from the earliest, the Talmud on, where you can get glimpses of women's lives and you hear women's voices and the voices of people you don't ordinarily hear because they're marginalized. It happens in the Hebrew Bible also, like we hear the lepers for a while in that account of the miracle that Elisha prophesizes, the deliverance from the siege. But they're not there enough. And as far as I can see, they're never there enough anywhere I look. The Shekhinah would say, if you ask this question of the Shekhinah who is speaking in these poems, she's not giving voice to those voices either. But she would say she is dwelling with those lives. She is listening to those voices, but also sharing what they have to express, understanding what they have to express, making sure that they aren't alone in their struggles and sufferings. And she would want those of us who aren't in those positions to remember that, she is dwelling, God is dwelling in and with all of those people. So when we marginalize human beings, when we institutionally oppress them, we're doing that to God. Not metaphorically, but she would say literally, like she is stuck with living through what we live through. And some of being human, it sucks. It's going to suck, right? She signed up for this. I didn't sign up to live through everybody individual human sufferings. But I think paying attention to the Shekhinah means wanting to reduce the amount of her suffering by reducing the amount of people's suffering. Like even if we don't care about people who are marginalized because they're marginalized, we don't see them very much, we don't hear them very much, because we're in a better situation. If we care about God, we should want God not to suffer what they're suffering. And the best way to relieve other people's sufferings is to listen to them, to invite them to speak, to give them a platform, to make their voices central instead of marginal.
Do we have any online questions? No? Okay. Go ahead, Wilson.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your lecture. I thought of in a little different frame as you were speaking of Paul Tillich. And Tillich has a statement he makes in which he's talking about transcendence pushed to its ultimate, that there is God beyond God which we do not know. But what that also meant for Tillich, that all other understandings of God are constructions. Constructions from ideas, from historical moments, from the destiny of a people, from the dilemma of a people. And that what I found exciting is you're constructing, you're constructing a new understanding of God, which does not mean you throw out everything in the past. You deliberately deal with it in order that there is some integration, but it is a new construction. That's just a reflection.
Thank you. And thank you. That's a great quote. You know, a God beyond God is a wonderful way to think about it. If you look at that Kabbalistic diagram, the tree of life, you see all of these different attributes or aspects of God. They're named. The bottom one is the Shekhinah, the top one is Keter, which means crown. But then beyond that, there's something called Ein Sof, which just means boundless. And I think that's the God beyond God. And it is, number one, it's, as I said, it's hard to relate to, at least for me. I'm just an ordinary person. So it's hard for me to relate to the God beyond God. And so I'm really grateful that we have a treasury, and what should be an ever expanding treasury, of ways of thinking about and relating to God. I'm really grateful for people like Judith Plaskow, who reminds us that many of those images are there living in the lives of the people that we don't include in our communities, or we include them but we don't listen to them, so we can't learn from them what they know about God. But also I feel like it's important to remember that we have agency in this, because God doesn't decide how we relate to God. And in the Hebrew Bible, at least, this is an endless source of frustration to God. God really would like to just, let's get our relationship settled. You know, like every now and then my wife and I have what we call relationship talks, where and she hates relationship talks. So her agenda is, let's just resolve every issue in our relationship right now so that we can go back to not talking about our relationship. One of the first questions she asked me was, because of the whole lesbian thing, she said, "Are you one of these people who wants to process all the time?" That would have been a deal breaker for her. God doesn't want to process all the time with us either. So in the Hebrew Bible, God keeps trying to say, okay, this is the way it's going to be. This is the way you relate to me, and I'll show up in these kinds of ways. And you do this, and it never really works. So I think God makes another decision, which is to let human beings choose from among a wide variety of images and conceptions of divinity, each of which helps us get close to God in different ways. None of which, as Paul Tillich reminds us, mean getting close to all of God, which I think is, that's the face we can't see, as God tells even Moses, right? We can't see that and live. We can't see that and be human, but we can relate to parts of God as long as we remember that they're parts. So God is there, ready to be related to, as long as we take the action of saying, I do, and entering into one of the many, many relationships with God that are possible, or the relationships that we know are possible, or the relationships with God that are there for us to create and discover.
Hi there. My question is about expanding images of the feminine. Too often I feel like it's about reproduction, it's about, embryos and wombs. I don't hear that kind of language with men. We don't talk about testicles and penises, right? So can
Isn't that great, by the way?
Isn't that great? So to expand beyond woman as childbearer, as fertility, can you help us with that?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I would say, first of all, if you, there are two different ways of going about this. And I think these are complementary ways, not contradictory ways. Although some people like may want to choose one or the other. Like Marcia Falk wants autonomous images of women. And that would include not only can we stop describing women in terms of their, female aspects of divinity in terms of body parts, the way a lot of that poem that I read from Shekhinah Speaks, which is the name of the collection, um, does, although not all of it. But the thing about uh, women's bodies is from a patriarchal perspective, from a white male supremacist perspective. That's what you notice about women, that their bodies are different from men's. And as you just pointed out, part of that is also the concealing of men's bodies, right? The fact that you can think of male images and aspects of God without listing body parts. So I think in Jewish tradition, naming the Shekhinah as queen would be an example of a non-body part, but also non-autonomous way of thinking about female divinity. So I think Marcia Falk would have issues with that because queen is defined in relation to king, and every deck of cards tells us which one is superior. Um, but so there's, on the one hand, autonomous images of God, and an example of that would be um, when the Shekhinah says, "Clean with the whirlwind where a uterus should be." Right. So I think that that's really messing with the traditional identification of female in a way that pushes it toward autonomy. Actually, that language, most of that language, not the whirlwind, but the other language, came from the Cosmo article, which was called "Why This Woman is Proud to Be Called the Pageant Queen Without a Uterus." So another way of expanding female God language is to expand our awareness of the gazillion ways there are to be a woman. And that includes both, okay, pageant queen without a uterus, well, pageant queen, not an autonomous way of thinking female. Without a uterus, we're still talking about uteruses, female body parts, right? So that would be the non-autonomous way of doing it. But there are a lot of everything that women do. And by women, I have a pretty broad definition of women, as you might imagine. But whatever your definition of women is, there are women whose lives and experiences are excluded from it. I guarantee it. You can use female God language that describes God as, as Madame Curie, right? Discovering elements. So Madame Curie revealing the secrets of the physical universe and in some ways being sickened by her proximity to those secrets. To me, that's a pretty powerful but autonomous female image of God. I'm not sure, am I getting to what you were asking though?
Yes.
So I would encourage everybody who is anywhere near women's lives, which I'm guessing is pretty much everybody in this room, to pay attention to those lives and to think about how every aspect of them, including the triumphs, the failures, the aches and pains, every aspect of those can be a source of female God language.
As you were speaking about the Shekhinah, I was wondering about her relationship to wisdom woman, Chokhmah. And I'm also, the last question pushed me toward that a little further because of the biblical images of God that share female characteristics or are female. Chokhmah seems to be the only one who isn't mother. Anyway, how would you relate Chokhmah to what you've been talking about?
So if you were a scholar of how the Shekhinah emerges in Jewish tradition, you would start probably by looking in places in the book of Proverbs and some other parts of the Bible that talk about wisdom as female. So wisdom is an ancient virtue. So when Hebrew culture started to intermingle with other cultures when it was still biblical times, you start getting some of the kind of discourse that you get in non-Jewish thinking, which includes thinking a lot about wisdom, and she's often personified as female. So there's a bit of this. So the image of wisdom as female, for the Kabbalists, the Kabbalists are a little weird when they are dividing up the male and female attributes on the tree of life. For me, the Kabbalists have a comparable relation to binary gender as Timothy Leary had to hallucinogens. When they started imbibing binary gender terms, they just had this wild cosmological response to it. And part of that was divvying up these attributes of God, and some of them, which we would be like, why is that considered female? They attribute to male, like Gevura, rigor, discipline, harshness. That's a female attribute for them. Chokhmah gets assigned to maleness, as you're pointing out, and I'm not sure why. It's not a male inflected word. The female images are, yeah, they're mother related. I think the Shekhinah, though, is maybe more present. I mean, I described her as an umbilical cord. I think that that's true, but I think she's also the queen of the material universe. I think that's what they also mean her to be. And if you think of her as the part of God who's most accessible to us, right? The rest of the tree of life is way beyond normative human experience, but the Shekhinah is right there, right? She's the immanent part. She's close to the material universe. I also think that I don't think that that's an image of, like one of these mothers who never goes away or anything. I think that's actually an autonomous image of femaleness for them. But there isn't a lot, and there isn't enough, because in patriarchal traditions, men tend to think of women in pretty narrow ways, and ways that, as Falk was complaining, are usually defined by either how women are other than men, or how they're lesser than men, or, patriarchal tradition prefers the moments when women are both lesser and other than men. So there's a real dearth of those descriptions.
Great, thank you so much. And this is not your last opportunity to hear from Dr. Ladin. She'll be speaking again tomorrow morning at 10:20. So more opportunities for dialogue coming up. So please join me in thanking her. I've been asked to make a couple brief